Hello, welcome to this morning and this latest slot on District Energy. If you'd like to take your seats, that would be super duper. We've got myself and two other speakers this morning focusing on both the sector and also the policy to 2050 and beyond. So I'll start off and get this going because we don't want to overrun the time because we'll get kicked off by the next bunch of speakers. So my name's Simon Woodward. I'm the chairman of the UK District Energy Association, and I'm the warm-up act for Aaron and Andrew, who will be speaking shortly about the government's grant programme and also about policy and regulation to 2050 and beyond. So just a little bit of a warm-up about who we are, why we're here. We've got the UK DA Pavilion just over there. Please come and say hello to us, but I'll just do a little bit of an introduction about who we are and member benefits if you'd like to come and join us. So we've got 150 members. We're the largest voice for district energy in the UK. And we've got a network of 500 individuals working in the sector. We've got some quite interesting member segmentation. About 50% of the members are actually developing building schemes, and the other 50% of the members are either supplying equipment or systems or providing advisory services. In terms of other benefits, we've got a monthly journal. We send that to all members monthly. It's about 50 to 60 pages, and it's your chance to show members and others in the association what you're doing in the sector. We've also got our website, which is the hub for what we do. It's our knowledge hub. So we've got information on what each member does, which is on the website. We've got our events, document library, jobs board and training register, so many benefits there. And then in terms of member meetings and contacts with BEIS, we've got a very close relationship with BEIS, now Energy Security and Net Zero. I won't read what's on the slide apart from the bit at the bottom, which I thought was a really nice thing for Jodie Pittaway from SSE to say. We find the UK DA to be an extremely effective advocate for heat networks. The UK DA is a respected voice in government and has a tried and tested approach to translating members' needs and views into direct policy advocacy. So just something nice said by one of our key members. We also run a number of webinars. We like to be a little bit contentious. As you'll see, one of the bottom ones, the one that says CPD certified, was actually looking at ambient loops versus fourth generation heat networks. We typically have about 200 people register for our webinars. The next webinar we've got coming up is actually chemical-free water treatment versus chemical water treatment, because the sector's a little bit divided at the moment as to whether you need to treat with chemicals or not. Then we've got in-person events. We're here today. We're at the Pavilion. Come and say hello to us. And we'll also be holding our conference in London later in the spring, and that will be at Canary Wharf. So a really nice venue. Come along and join us at the event. Just to final few benefits, we've got a training register. So it's a unique document. We update it twice each year. It's got 100 different training courses in it. Many of them are free. 25 members run those courses. So please do go onto our website and download it. We've got our jobs board as well, so if you'd like to save some agency fees, if you're looking for somebody in the sector, if you want to recruit somebody, we've got a free jobs board on our website. And finally, we're just about to launch our series of podcasts. We've already recorded our first podcast, so if you want to come and become a member and talk about a really interesting topic on our podcast, please do, and we'll be having our first UK DA Awards at our conference at Canary Wharf later this year. So that's a very quick run through from me. Memberships up on the screen, so that'll be available to people to download after the show. We can drop you an email about it. My name's Simon Woodward, chairman of the UK DA. There's my phone number. If you'd like to come and join, please do give me a shout, give me a call, drop me an email. And without further ado, I'll pass you on to Andrew Cripps, technical director for Triple Point, which is the organisation that manages the government's grant programmes. Andrew.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. It's a very strange, echoey sound in this place, which is quite disconcerting. Anyway, welcome everybody. You may have registered. I'm not on the programme, but I'm here to put a bit of the context, which leads into what Aaron's going to be sharing with you about the next stages of the policy process. But what I want to run through for you today is a little bit about how we've got to where we are and why what Aaron's going to tell us is so important. So I've kind of covered that. So we've got a little bit about what we're doing on HDIP, GH&F, market transformation, Beehive, and leading into zoning. So I think you've all come here today because you understand this. I'm not going to dwell on it all that much. But essentially, we've committed to zero carbon. We need to transform heating. We all think, most of us think that heat networks are part of the solution for that, for at least a section of the country. So we need a radical change in the amount of heat networks that are in place. And we need to make it easier for that to happen, because it's too hard, and without change we won't get this to happen. But it's not as if we're starting from nowhere, and I think the department and our colleagues there are to be congratulated for the considerable effort they've put in over the last decade or so. An awful lot has happened. I expect most of you are familiar with at least some of this, but it's worth just introducing it to remind you. The process has started really with the Heat Networks Delivery Unit, HNDU, and over the last decade or more they've been supporting mainly local authorities, but increasingly other types of bodies, to do the initial thinking about having a heat network. But one of the things, and those studies have led to many, many projects progressing, but what was realized some years ago is most of those schemes, whilst they're attractive in terms of carbon saving and delivering secure heat, they're not actually commercially that attractive at the moment. There's too much risk and the costs are too high, the return was too slow. So this has led to the project I'm going to tell you a little bit more about, which is the Heat Network Investment Project. And this has been providing grant funding to enable projects to be built. That scheme has come to an end, and it's being followed by the Green Heat Network Fund, which is open at the moment. I'm not going to explain that project in detail because that's not the purpose of today's session. But if you want to know more, come and talk to me after this session. And another thing I hope you've seen, which I think is really important, it's just been announced again, is the Heat Network Efficiency Scheme. And the focus of this is on trying to make existing heat networks more efficient, the clue's in the name. So these are relatively small interventions to improve the efficiency of networks, improve controls, manage the temperatures better, increase insulation levels. So if you don't know about that, go and investigate, because it's really important. But these things aren't enough, and we need to go further with these. These are the remaining strands I want to introduce today, and it feeds into what Aaron's going to talk about. But really, to deliver what we need, we haven't got the market we need. We need to grow the market, we need it to work better, we need essentially a radical change in what's going on. And that's the market framework, the support to market development, and this overall banner that we're working on, the Heat Networks Transformation Program. I dropped this one in just to remind everybody that this is from the CCC, Committee on Climate Change, and this is one of their profiles for how we get to zero carbon. And in this diagram, this part and this part are both heat from heat networks. I don't know why they couldn't put them next to each other on the diagram, but never mind. And whichever way you look at it, this is a big change. You know, we're looking at 15 to 20% of all heat coming from heat networks. At the moment, we're on maybe 2 or 3%. And in order to do that, you can estimate this different ways, but it's something like £60 billion of investment needed in heat networks. Maybe it's 50 billion, maybe it's 70 billion, whatever it is, it's a big number. That's 2 or 3 billion pounds per year we need to get to. Now, I don't know what you think the figure is today, Simon, but it's a lot less than that. And I'm going to show you schemes that, you know, we're in the hundreds of millions per year, but we're not over £1 billion a year. So we've got an enormous amount of growth in order to make this happen. And we've got to we've got to look at how we're going to do it. So I just want to tell you a little bit about HNIP, Heat Network Investment Project. The purpose of this was to get schemes going, get things underway, because what's absolutely clear is it's much easier to convince people to join a heat network that exists. If it's a concept, it's quite hard to sell it. So by getting networks started, people can see it, they can see it's working, they can join. So we're funding about 40 projects through this. And this has actually worked. We've come through Brexit and COVID just about intact. It's been a very difficult phase to do this, but we've managed to get progress. The diagram on the map shows where the sites are, more or less. There's more detail of this on the web. And we've done what on the face of it are pretty big numbers, where about 3/4 of a terawatt-hour of heat that will be delivered, 150 kilometers of pipe, a little shy of 900 million of schemes. But in the context of what I said of 60 billion, this is an early, you know, it's significant, but it's an early step in the way. So there's an awful lot more to be done. Now, a few interesting things have been happening through HNIP. And the first one is about scale of projects. When we started, in the first rounds of the competition, we held a funding round each 3 months. And in the early rounds, schemes were coming through. These aren't small schemes, 3, 5, 10 gigawatt hours a year, but they're not enormous. And in the later stages, people had wised up to the need to go bigger. The market, people knew this is what was necessary. And we were starting to see schemes coming through at 20, 30, 40 gigawatt hours per year. And this has continued in the Green Heat Network Fund. We're seeing schemes that are bigger again. So this ambition is really important, and I want to encourage those of you in the sector to engage with it. The other fascinating change, which we didn't expect to happen so quickly, is you probably can't see this, but in the first round, the first year of HNIP, most of the projects were using gas CHP, so they're the orange ones in the diagram at the top left. And by the end, we still had 1 or 2 with gas CHP, but they were kind of legacy schemes. And the ones with the heat pumps in the green are completely dominating, although there's a very important slice, which is energy from waste. So if there's energy from waste going on, if waste materials being burnt in order to generate electricity, you can get really cost-effective and carbon-effective heat from those. So there's a big slice of the market from that, but a lot of heat pumps. So this is fascinating, the rate of change of this in just a handful of years. And of course the Green Heat Network Fund, the Green Heat Network Fund only funds low carbon heat networks. So they will all be in the low carbon slice going forward. Okay, so that's kind of where we're coming from, what's going on now. I've mentioned the Green Heat Network Fund. I'll just introduce it very quickly. It's very similar in concept to HNIP. It's providing funding to enable schemes that wouldn't otherwise go ahead to be built out. They're all low carbon, as I mentioned. It allows both for new networks to be built, but also the decarbonisation of existing networks. There are networks out there which are, whilst they're supplying heat effectively, they're still relatively high carbon, so there's an opportunity to reduce the carbon intensity of those networks. What I want to focus on today more is this commitment to market transformation that's coming through this, and I'm going to tell you about that on the next slides. The programme's progressing well. There have been a few announcements of early schemes. There's a whole lot more news coming through. We don't announce them until they're in contract, so my colleagues are busy getting these into contract as we speak. I also want to mention, and I'll explain this more a little bit later, is a thing called Beehive, which is a method for procuring both district heating services, but also procuring funding for district heating, which I will come back to on a later slide. So, as I've been telling you, we anticipate an enormous amount of growth in the heat network sector. We need it. In order to deliver this amount of change in the sector, we need a lot of change. We need essentially everything to grow. We need more supply of equipment. We need more installers of equipment. We need more designers of heat networks. We need more funders of heat networks. And actually one thing I think is understated is the importance of local authority people. The local authorities, we need them, more people there who understand heat networks, because they're critical in the delivery of systems typically. If a network's going to be built, you have to interact with the local authority, and we need them to understand. We need enough skilled people there, or we're in a lot of trouble. So we also need to progress, to have better technologies. I think if we can only do as well as we do today, it's not going to work. We need to do better. We need higher performance equipment. We need reduced losses. We need to get things right. We need to know how to do things better. So we need that investment in research and development. So how are we going to get there? We need government support, which I said, I must congratulate them. They've been consistent and done extremely well to get to where we are. We need exemplar projects, which are coming from the programs I've mentioned and from others. We need the policy framework, which we're going to see in grants. But we also need the way in which projects are delivered to be done properly. And we need everybody, all of you out there, to engage with this to help us do these things well. And one way you can engage with this is the market transformation commitments. This is something which GH&F projects have to do. So GH&F projects are committed to doing these things. They have to engage and show how they're doing these things. So this is about the way they procure. So we want fair and open procurement. We don't want kind of brown envelopes and behind closed doors, anything of that stuff, because that leads to problems. we need to engage with local communities and encourage the development of local supply chains. If we want an ongoing sustainable sector here, we want there to be local jobs. We want people to recognize the benefit in their area. And all the best companies are beginning to engage in this and thinking about bringing local workforce on. It's obviously a local scheme. If we're going to spend 1, 2, 3, 4 billion pounds in a city, there's time over decades to bring local people up to speed and engage with them. And we want to celebrate that and make it happen. In support of that, we need a lot of training. So lots more training academies. There was one just launched the other day. I hope you've got the details, Aaron, because I can't remember where it is. But there's opportunities here, apprenticeship schemes. We've got so many people to retrain. People aren't going to be fitting gas boilers. They're going to be connecting into heat networks. So let's think about these things and engage. And as I mentioned, we need innovation and research to get to where we need to. And we're already seeing this from the program. People are committing to recruitment. They're committing to doing more in the UK, R&D, thinking about apprenticeships and looking at the embodied carbon of these networks. All these important things are beginning to happen. And I encourage you all to engage with this if this is at all relevant to you. The final part I wanted to introduce to you is this thing called BEHIVE. The acronym used to stand for the BEIS Heat Network Investment Vehicle. And what it is a specific piece which is aiming to help to bring money to the heat network sector. It's a method by which a local authority or other public body can obtain funding from the private sector, both as straight funding and also active capital, which means bringing with the project, it's bringing expertise with the money. So it's a possibility now to say, I'd like a heat network, and you essentially hand the whole thing over, and people will come in to support that and make it all happen. So it's a dynamic purchase system. You can go and investigate how it works. It's not part of the Green Heat Network Fund, but it's associated with it. We've got at least another 2 years to operate for this, so we'd like you to engage because we know these things take time. It can work for a whole new heat network, and it can also work if you happen to own a heat network and you want to refinance it. It's a possibility to work that way too. And the reason I mention this, and it's really the final piece that feeds into what Aaron's going to talk about, is if we're going to spend £60 billion on heat networks, that isn't going to come with a 20 or 25 billion pound subsidy from the taxpayer. We need these heat networks to, that's on my last slide, we need these heat networks to be commercially sensible. So we need the conditions to be right for heat networks to be built out without subsidy. Maybe not next year or the year after, but if we're going to do this through the 30s and 40s, we need this whole situation to be changed. And for that reason, we need it to be easier to develop heat networks, and we need to provide better protection for heat customers. We need all of these things to come together, which is why we have to have zoning and regulation. So I'm going to pass on. That's my last slide. I hope I'm easy to find. Triple Point Heat Network Investment Management. Talk to me afterwards, but I'll pass on to Aaron to tell you what's going on with the zoning piece.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, for that fantastic segue into my presentation material. And hello, everyone. My name's Aaron Mornan. I'm the head of Heat Network Policy in the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, formerly BEIS. And I'm going to be talking to you today about the government's plans for heat network regulation and for heat network zoning. So it's probably easiest just to give an intro to this area if I talk through the timeline of what we've been doing in the Heat Networks Policy team and in the department since 2018. So in 2018, the Competition and Markets Authority concluded its sector study into the heat networks market. And while it found that in general, standards of consumer service, if you live on a heat network, are good, it found that there was a minority of customers who get really bad service from their heat network. And the Competition and Markets Authority recommended that government introduce statutory regulation so that heat network customers are treated with equivalent terms to those who get their heating through gas or electricity directly. And that was the start of my journey into heat networks policy as well, because that's when I joined the team. We've since consulted on our plans for how heat network regulation will work, our plans to appoint Ofgem as the heat networks regulator in Great Britain. And I'll be going into talk in a bit more detail about exactly what that system of consumer protection will look like in a bit more detail. But while I'm on the timeline, I thought I'd also point out that the heat network zoning that Andrew has referenced was also launched in 2020 in the government's energy white paper under the previous Boris Johnson administration, where we committed to developing heat network zones in England by 2025. And again, I'll go into a bit more detail about what these are, but broadly, heat network zones will be areas where certain categories of buildings will be required to connect to a heat network. And we really see this as a growth mechanism for the heat network sector, a way to work with local government and the private sector to leverage that private sector investment, which Andrew was talking about so convincingly, and to try and get towards the scale of market investment and the scale of market growth that the Committee for Climate Change has said we need to get to by 2050. And then the main topic of my conversation will be about the legislation that we're going to need to underpin all this. So in July last year, the government brought forward what was then the Energy Security Bill, now the Energy Bill, to Parliament, which legislates in what's called primary legislation for both heat network regulation and heat network zoning. So really a landmark bit of legislation for the heat network sector, the first time that heat networks have been the subject of any kind of primary legislation in the UK. And that's been the work of my team over the past year. And I'll be talking about the next steps for that legislation in this presentation. So I'm going to skip on there because I've already talked about that. So while we aim to have the Energy Bill receive royal assent and go off for signature by King Charles at some point this year, we are now thinking about the next stages for legislation. So for those who've been unfortunate enough to read a bill, it can be quite vague. It takes broad powers to do things later in secondary legislation. And it's the work of government policy officials to then work out what those secondary regulations will specify and how we will draft the policies going forward. And we're planning to go out to consultation on a lot of this really important detail over the next year and a half. So my main message today is, if you've been thinking about engaging in the heat network sector, the next year and a half is really going to be crucial for setting the direction for heat networks policy to 2030 and 2050 as we try and set the sector on the right path to get us to those 2050 deployment targets that Andrew was talking about. I'm going to start with the first consultation in early summer. So this will be the first time where we talk about where the Department for Energy Security and Ofgem talk about how consumer protection will actually work, what things will be judged on a heat network basis by Ofgem as the regulator. How will you need to apply for it? How will that system work? How will you need to prepare in terms of consumer protection standards and technical standards, which are going to be the technical standards by which heat networks will have to design, build, operate and maintain their heat networks? And how will a system of additional statutory rights and powers operate? Because we've said that as part of heat network regulation, heat networks will be given the right to dig up the roads and apply for permitted development with the same facility that electricity and gas companies currently have. And then in early autumn, we'll be going out for another consultation on heat network zoning, again talking in a bit more detail about how that will operate. And the second heat network regulation consultation will be in late 2023, right up towards the end of the year. Before in 2024, we and Ofgem publish what are going to be our authorization conditions, and those will be the final full set of conditions that heat networks will have to meet in order to be regulated from the start of regulation in 2024. And going forwards, then heat network consumers will have statutory rights to complain about the standard performance they're getting from their heat network, be able to complain to Ofgem and the Energy Ombudsman and Citizens Advice within Great Britain. So I'm going to go into a bit more detail about some of those consultations now and just try and talk about some of the topics that will be covered in them before I think towards the end of the presentation we can have a bit of Q&A with myself, Simon and Andrew as well. So apologies, this is a bit cut off, but let me just highlight a couple of things for you in that first consultation, which is coming kind of late spring, early summer this year. So we'll be talking about how there will be a price benchmarking system of price regulation for heat networks. What we're interested in is preventing disproportionate prices where heat networks are taking advantage of their monopoly powers to charge heat network consumers at a rate that is simply making them profits and is not reflective of their underlying efficiency as a network. We are keen to make sure that heat networks are a profit-making enterprise, but where they're taking advantage of their consumers, our aim is that Ofgem will be able to intervene to prevent disproportionate prices. We're also going to be talking about quality of service standards. So what will be the key KPIs that heat networks will be judged upon that Ofgem will judge them upon in terms of deciding whether to intervene and take enforcement action against the heat network. And those will be things like the length of time it takes to provide compensation if the heat network goes on outage, as well as providing certain bits of minimum information to their heat network consumers and preventing some of the horror stories that we get at the moment where heat supply contracts just don't have even a price on, or there's no information provided to the consumer about what being on a heat network means. There's a variety of other topics on there. I will also just say we'll also be consulting on in a bit more detail about the pre-contractual transparency there. So trying to reform the EPCs that get provided to people who either buy or rent a property to try and improve the standard of information that's provided to people about what being on a heat network means, and try and improve the standard of information that's provided about the CO2 emissions of the network or the cost of being on a heat network. And then further in that consultation, we'll also be talking about, as I said, the system of heat network licensing, so the powers that will be provided to heat networks so that they have the same statutory powers as gas and electricity companies to, as I said, dig up the roads, cross linear obstacles like railway lines and canals, enable permitted development to happen, so to remove the requirement to apply for planning permission for certain stages of heat network development, and really try and make sure that heat networks as energy infrastructure have the same powers as other piece of energy infrastructure like gas or electricity companies in order to develop what is going to be these crucial networks for meeting our 2050 target. And then we'll also be talking about the process of auditing and monitoring of the heat network sector, as well as the system by which we will try and recover the costs of heat network regulation. So we've committed that the cost of heat network regulation will be recovered from both heat network consumers, but also gas and electricity consumers, so that we're spreading the costs of regulation over a wider base to ensure that the costs don't solely fall on heat network consumers and risk stymieing this nascent market. And then in early autumn this year, we're planning to go out to consultation on our zoning project. So this will be the first time that we really put forward concrete proposals for how heat network zoning will operate in England from 2025. And just to highlight a couple of areas there, the system of zone delivery. So how will local authorities be able to work with the private sector? What will that system look like to work with the private sector to develop, to first designate a zone, and then work with the private sector on how it would be then developed into an operating heat network? How will it work where the local authority and the private sector zone developer will be notifying buildings that they have to connect to it? And how do we really facilitate private sector investment to get to the kind of pace and scale that we need to develop the heat network sector to meet those 2050 targets? I think I'll leave it there on terms of I'll go on to the second one on heat network zoning. Just to pick out a couple of other points, we'll be putting forward proposals for which categories of buildings will be required to connect within heat network zones. What will be the system by which heat sources in or around zones will be required to connect to local networks over the period of developing a heat network within a zone. What will be the process by which statutory consultees will have to be consulted in the designation of a zone? So we always hear it's really important to make sure that if we're going to be progressing with heat network zoning, that the views of the local electricity company or the local gas company, certain other local bodies that are important for a local area are consulted as part of the designation of a zone, and we'll be putting forward proposals for how that system of statutory consultation should work, as well as talking about the penalties and enforcement process for heat network zoning. And then in the final consultation of this year, probably getting on towards December time, we'll be talking about the longer term details of heat network regulation. So heat network regulation will be a phased product. Starting in 2024, we're looking to make sure that we and Ofgem have the powers to intervene in instances of poor consumer protection, so where consumers are getting a very bad deal. But in the longer term, throughout the 2020s, we'll be deploying certain extra parts of the heat networks regulation to further improve the market. And these are some of the topics that we've talked about being part of that portfolio. When step-in provisions, what will happen in future if regulated heat networks go bankrupt or are otherwise unable to provide heat to their consumers because of certain challenging financial situations. We'll be putting forward proposals for how that system of statutory step-in provisions should work, akin to what happens in gas and electricity markets, although of course it's a different market. We'll be putting forward different proposals. We'll also be consulting on how this system of minimum technical standards should work, what the standards will be, and how they'll be enforced to ensure that there are minimum standards for how you design, build, and operate a network across Great Britain, and to really solve one of the major underpinning challenges of the sector, that we have a collection of really inefficient networks, and that leads in the end to poor consumer prices. And then finally, talking as well about the system of heat network CO2 regulation. So how will government ensure that this growing heat networks market actually meets its 2050 targets and decarbonises? And this is going to be really, government, local authorities, and the private sector working together to get towards that decarbonisation. But what will be the framework within which government will nudge and push those heat networks to decarbonise, as well as how will it support the finances of those heat network companies to meet those 2050 targets, is another element that we'll be talking about in that later consultation. So I appreciate that was a bit of a sheep dip into the whole area of heat networks regulation. Hopefully there was at least something in there interesting for everyone, and I think we'll go over to the Q&A session now. I don't know what the plan is. Should we all sit up here, stand up here?
Thanks, Andrew. Andrew and Aaron, do you want to take a seat? Lovely. Okay. There's a lady who's roving around, and there's a gentleman there who's got his hand up in the row. If you'd like to say who you are and where you're from, and then give us your question. There's a lady just giving you a microphone.
Andy Frew from Northern Ireland, housing executive. I think we're going to have to rely on extracting heat from the environment, from bodies of water and from underground, perhaps even storing heat underground. Is there any developments, regulatory developments in parallel that would complement that?
Okay, thanks. Very interesting question. Andrew or Aaron, would you like to pick that one up?
Well, thanks very much for the question. I think it's really important for the growth of the heat network sector and for decarbonisation of heat networks that we're able to unlock the heat sources that could provide so much low or zero carbon waste heat. Our proposals that are in England, where a heat source is in or near a heat network zone, that there will be statutory requirements on them to either negotiate with a local network and eventually potentially even be required to connect. Those will be the subject of the consultation coming out this summer that I spoke about. And we're in close consultation with the Northern Irish government about similar proposals that could be developed in Northern Ireland. But as I understand, at the moment there are no similar zoning proposals for Northern Ireland. But we're working with them on, hopefully in future there will be.
I don't think I have much to add. I think the sources is one thing. Obviously, some of them are done. It's about Canals and Rivers Trust, Environment Agency, which are instruments of government anyway, so the government ought to be able to make those things happen. But I think the part that's interesting is the other sources, whether it's data centres, waste, spare, process heat from industry. That's the space where this is a really interesting development that is aiming to do precisely what you're asking for.
Thanks very much. Do we have any other questions? There's a lady over there, I believe.
Hi. So I was just wondering about the point on the role of the private sector in heat network development, and whether you think it's more from a funding perspective or like the role of commercial organisations in actually leading the development of heat networks, and whether you have any sort of interesting case studies where that's been applied.
Okay,
Thanks.
do you just mind saying where you're from? Sorry.
Oh yeah, I'm a researcher at a company called Innovation Gateway.
Okay, lovely, thanks very much. Aaron or Andrew? Andrew.
So I'll start. I think what's clear is that we expect this to be a mixture. I don't think that the private sector could do this on their own. There has to be a really strong public sector involvement. This is very much about doing the right thing in the right local area. But at the same time, not every local authority would want to or would have the capacity to really make this happen. So we expect there to be a partnership in almost all cases. It's not really the role of local government to own a multi-billion-pound heat network. That's not to say it couldn't be done, and the Danish model, that's the route they've taken. They're predominantly locally developed. Some of them are subsequently sold to the private sector. So to be honest, the answer to your question is everything from purely local authority developed through to the extreme we're beginning to see with Worthing in particular, who's offering a concession agreement at the moment. So they're saying, come and develop our heat network, run it for us. We've got the setup in Bristol with Vattenfall, who've taken over the local authority networks to grow and to grow it faster. Bristol have done a fabulous job, but we think that the private sector oomph can make it go even faster. So for me, it's absolutely a mixture. There isn't enough capacity in local government to do it, or the public sector. But at the same time, it has to be quite closely managed for the reasons that Aaron's been referring to make sure that people are properly protected. Anything to add?
I guess all I would say is, that the summer zoning consultation I was talking about will set out our proposals for how local government should be able to work with and facilitate private sector, investment and development of heat networks, consumer protection through Ofgem oversight will be fantastic in and of itself, but it also enables governments to be more confident in awarding, exclusivity to certain heat networks to develop in zones. And that will be really important for facilitating investment. If investors can be certain that they're going to get, an exclusive right in some forms to develop within a zone, and are going to have a right to require certain buildings to connect, that will make it a much more, attractive proposition to put your money in heat networks in England. But those consumers can also be safe in the knowledge that they are regulated to the same extent that gas and electricity consumers are regulated, and that Ofgem, the Energy Ombudsman and Citizens Advice will be there, in case things go wrong in terms of the consumer standards that they receive.
Brilliant, thanks very much indeed. Do we have any more questions from the audience? Well, we've got these two speakers here. Oh, there's a lady in the row over there. Just while the microphone's been passed around, I've been in the heat network sector for 30 years, building and developing heat networks. That's what I do as my day job when I'm not being chairman of the UKDA. And what's coming out in the next year is a tsunami of policy and regulations that will completely obliterate everything that's gone before it and totally transform the heat network sector. So please keep in touch with what's coming. Over to the lady.
Thank you. Liz Warren from SE2. Andrew, you said something just then which made me chuckle about how different bits of government should be able to get other bits to do things. So my question is actually for Aaron about how you're working with whatever the department that now does planning is called, just in case it's changed today, and how, particularly with zoning, how you integrate thinking about planning with a capital P and heat network zoning.
No, it's a really important question. The ability of government to join up and focus on a core objective is something it's really important to get anything done in terms of government. We're really closely linked up with what is the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. I think maybe a year or so old. And what I will say is that the zoning legislation will be a separate legislative vehicle to planning. They will be separate. The department I now work for, Energy Security and Net Zero, will own the zoning legislation, and DLUC will continue to own planning in general. There are lots of different ways that they will interact. but we have fantastic engagement from our DLUC colleagues in terms of making sure this works. And that's not something I can say about every project in terms of join up across government, so I'm really grateful for their support in that, and really positive about the outlook and making sure that it will be a workable product that we actually end up delivering.
Brilliant, thanks very much indeed. Any other questions from the audience at all? Oh, there's a gentleman in the back, just in the back row there. There we go. Just while the microphone's being passed around, I should just reiterate that when the Danes brought in the heat law in the 1970s, it transformed Danish energy mix, which is why we have now 90% of Copenhagen on heat networks, and why 70% of heat in Denmark is supplied from district heating. So this is not something to be taken lightly. Heat network zoning is coming to every urban area in the UK, or England, shall I say. And if you find yourself in a heat network zone and there's somebody creating a heat network, you will be mandated to connect, most probably, but read the small print. Anyway, over to the gentleman for the question.
Michael Woods from Colchester. Slight off topic, and maybe somewhat the elephant in the room is, the price of electricity, if you all want us to go to with heat pumps versus what gas is, and where government policy is going to even out the subsidies and other such things.
Nice question, Michael. I'll pass you over to Aaron.
I think we all acknowledge that as one of the major blockers in terms of developing low carbon heat networks, but low carbon heat infrastructure in general. It's something that's very high up the list of things we need to get done in terms of the group and the area I work in. So we're looking forward to being able to say more over the next year or so in terms of price rebalancing or whatever it is that you call that general policy issue. And are really hopeful and positive that we'll be able to say something really good about that. And that then when we publish in December our proposals for decarbonisation for heat networks, it won't be so much government saying you have to meet these targets and we're going to put you at a financial disadvantage for installing your large heat pump. It's actually, this is the target you need to reach, but it's actually an attractive commercial proposition as well. So that's our aim.
Brilliant, thanks very much. Joel, and there's a gentleman there as well.
So, hi everyone, I'm Joel Hamilton. I work closely with Aaron, but in the heat network delivery unit. There's actually 2 points. One on the question about price rebalance, on the price difference. I think actually that's something that heat networks need to leverage its power for, because if you can access low carbon waste heat sources, you can actually get over that problem where otherwise you wouldn't be able to in sort of building level heat pump or other decarbonisation solution. But the real question for you, although it might be one for the end, so we'll see, is what are you most excited about over the next year or two?
Brilliant. And while the microphone's being passed around, do you want to say what you're most excited about, Aaron?
I'll let Andrew say what he's most excited about. I have to say I'm most excited for the zoning consultation because it's an area that is so innovative. Actually, it's really a new policy that we're progressing in England. It's drawing on inspiration from Denmark, but as we've been talking about, the model for heat network development in England is going to be very private sector focused. As we said, public sector just doesn't have the available capital. We need to work out a framework to ensure that there's local credibility, that local government feels comfortable designating these zones, but in the end it's the private sector that's building them and operating them and has Ofgem oversight. And that really is, a new way of doing things. So I'm really excited for, sharing those proposals, developing the legislation, and putting it into practice.
Thanks. I think I might have said the same thing. So, but building on from that, I think it's the amount of change we're going to see. I think a really exciting thing is the projects that are coming on stream, that we can see the beginnings of this happening now. The growth, for example, in heat pumps and also energy from waste, things that are really helping to transform the situation. So I think it's the rate of change that's coming through and the opportunities for so many people, which is going to drive along for these parts to happen. I think on the point about the energy rebalancing, an area I think we all need to get smarter on is flexibility and trading opportunities. That every heat network has the potential to trade in the flexibility market if we get, with the right support. I think we need help to do it, but we're so much better placed. Put in the right thermal storage, the right systems and controls, and there's an angle there that we need to exploit much more.
Brilliant, thanks very much. Another question from the gentleman? 2 minutes.
Certainly industrial gas customers get their gas cheap on the basis that it's interruptible, and maybe there's scope for some tariffs that you switch things on and off. I'm wondering about ambient heat networks where individual heat pumps take their heat out of heat that's been piped in the street. Are they going to be covered by the regulations?
Over to Aaron.
Thanks very much. Yes, so the definitions that we've included in the energy bill mean that if each individual heat pump within the property is then connected to a central source of generation that's exterior to the property, then that will count as a heat network. So there needs to be some kind of third party that operates a central source of generation that then boosts the ambient flow that goes to then that individual heat pump. Then it will be a heat network. Otherwise, it will just be an individual heat pump with an ambient loop, if that distinction makes sense. But that's how we've split it within the definitions of the bill.
So another point, I think absolutely this evolution of tariffs, the opportunity to take advantage of lower cost of electricity, say at night or whenever it's super windy, it's part of how we need to design the systems, and we need to get the electricity market to evolve. And I think and actually that's a reason for not doing the ambient loop things, because of course you've got the scattered heat pumps which are harder to control. So there's a balance here to strike in all of these things.
Brilliant, thanks very much indeed. I think we've reached our allotted 3/4 an hour, so it just remains for me to ask you to give the speakers a round of applause. And if you'd like to come and talk to myself, Simon Woodward, Aaron or Andrew, we're just over there in the UKDA and Energy Security Net Zero Pavilion. Thanks very much indeed.